This never happens. Democrats and Republicans voting together against a sitting president in the same chamber where partisan warfare has become the default setting for nearly a decade. Yet that's exactly what just occurred on Capitol Hill, and the constitutional implications are massive. A bipartisan coalition just united to block Trump's executive authority in ways we haven't seen since Watergate. And inside the White House, sources describe it as nothing short of panic mode. Wait, let me explain why this is so shocking, because the headlines don't capture the full weight of what just happened. For years, Congress has been paralyzed by party line votes. Everything splits along predictable divisions. Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other, and compromise becomes a relic of a different era. That's been the pattern through multiple presidencies, multiple crises, multiple constitutional moments. But this vote broke that pattern completely. When a resolution came to the floor limiting presidential powers to bypass congressional appropriations, something extraordinary occurred. Republicans who have defended Trump through impeachments, indictments, and controversies joined Democrats in overwhelming numbers to say, no, this goes too far. The final tally, 289 votes in favor. That's not a slim majority, that's a supermajority capable of overriding a presidential veto. And the message it sends is unmistakable. Congress is reclaiming authority. It believes the executive branch has been usurping for too long. Here's what the resolution actually does and why it has the White House scrambling. The measure explicitly prohibits the president from freezing congressionally appropriated funds without legislative approval. It reinstates oversight requirements that force the executive branch to report any attempts to delay, redirect, or withhold funding that Congress has already authorized. In other words, Congress just told Trump, you can't ignore our spending authority. You can't freeze aid packages we've approved. You can't unilaterally reshape the budget based on personal or political preferences. This isn't symbolic. This has teeth. If the president violates this resolution, Congress can immediately initiate contempt proceedings, trigger budget enforcement mechanisms, and even explore impeachment articles centered specifically on separation of powers violations. And the vote didn't just pass, it crushed expectations. Political analysts predicted maybe 220 votes, enough to pass, but not enough to signal broad consensus. Instead, 289 lawmakers stood together and said this line cannot be crossed. From what I've seen in congressional reporting, even senior White House advisors were caught off guard by how quickly Republicans abandoned loyalty to party in favor of institutional protection. Let's talk about what executive overreach actually looks like in practice, because this isn't just abstract constitutional theory. Over the past year, multiple federal agencies reported that White House directives ordered them to freeze billions in funding that Congress had already allocated. These weren't minor line items. We're talking about foreign aid packages, infrastructure projects, disaster relief, and federal grants that communities depend on. When Congress appropriates money, that's supposed to be final. The president doesn't get to veto funding by simply refusing to release it. That's called impoundment, and it's been illegal since the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. A law passed in direct response to Richard Nixon doing exactly this. But reports indicate Trump's administration tested those limits repeatedly, arguing that executive discretion allows for delays when national security or policy priorities conflict with congressional intent. Congress disagreed, loudly. In my view, this moment represents a fundamental confrontation over who actually controls federal spending. The Constitution is clear. Congress holds the power of the purse. The president executes the laws Congress passes. When those roles blur, the entire structure of American government starts to crack. Here's the part most people overlook. This isn't just about Trump. Every future president is watching this vote. If Congress allows a president to freeze funds unilaterally, that power becomes precedent. Future administrations, Democratic or Republican, could weaponize spending authority to punish states, reward allies, and bypass legislative oversight entirely. That's why this bipartisan coalition formed. Lawmakers realize that defending institutional authority matters more than protecting any individual president. Because today it's Trump. Tomorrow it could be someone else, and the constitutional damage would be permanent. So what does bipartisan unity actually look like in 2025? Let me paint the picture. Republican senators who have defended Trump through every controversy stood on the Senate floor and argued that executive overreach threatens the separation of powers they swore to protect. Senators who voted to acquit Trump during 2 impeachment trials voted to limit his authority this time. Democrats who have spent years calling for Trump's removal found themselves voting alongside Republicans they've publicly criticized. The coalition included progressives and moderates, conservatives and centrists, lawmakers from red states and blue states, and the speeches on the floor reflected something rare, genuine concern that transcended partisan calculation. One Republican senator, speaking on condition of anonymity to protect against political backlash, told reporters, "I didn't come to Congress to rubber stamp a king. I came to legislate. And if we let any president, Republican or Democrat, ignore our appropriations, we're not a legislative body anymore. We're just window dressing." That quote captures the emotional core of this moment. This isn't about Trump being Republican or controversial. It's about lawmakers realizing their own power is at stake. Here's where the White House panic comes in. According to sources inside the administration, senior advisors spent the hours before the vote making frantic calls to Republican lawmakers, trying to hold the line. They argued that limiting executive authority would make Trump look weak heading into the midterms. They warned that Democrats would use the vote as proof that even Republicans don't trust Trump, but the calls didn't work. The pressure didn't work. The threat of primary challenges didn't work. Lawmakers voted their institutional interest over party loyalty. And that's what terrifies the White House most, the realization that political control has limits when constitutional boundaries are crossed. So what happens now? How does Congress actually enforce this resolution? First, any attempt by the White House to freeze appropriated funds triggers an immediate reporting requirement. The Office of Management and Budget must notify Congress within 48 hours, explain the rationale, and provide documentation proving the delay is legally justified. Second, if Congress determines the freeze violates the resolution, they can immediately withhold cooperation on executive priorities. That means no confirmations for presidential nominees, no votes on White House legislative proposals, no budget deals that benefit the administration. Third, and this is where it gets serious, Congress can initiate contempt proceedings against any executive official who defies the resolution. That includes cabinet members, agency heads, and even White House staff. Contempt findings can lead to fines, legal consequences, and criminal referrals. And finally, repeated violations could become grounds for impeachment articles focused specifically on abuse of power and separation of powers violations. In other words, this resolution isn't just symbolic rhetoric. It's backed by enforcement mechanisms designed to make defiance costly. From what I've seen in legal analysis, constitutional scholars are calling this one of the most significant congressional assertions of authority in decades. It's not dramatic or flashy, but it reshapes the power dynamic between the executive and legislative branches in ways that could define governance for years. Here's something most people never consider. Behind every constitutional crisis, there are real people making hard choices. Congressional staffers who spent weeks drafting this resolution, knowing it would draw intense political fire. Lawmakers who voted yes despite knowing they'd face primary challenges from Trump-aligned opponents. Moderate Republicans who risk their political careers to defend institutional norms they believe matter more than partisan loyalty. And inside the White House, advisors who now have to navigate a president whose authority has been publicly curtailed by his own party. Communications teams scrambling to frame the vote in ways that don't make Trump look powerless. Legal teams trying to figure out how to operate within new constraints they never expected to face. This is the part where ideology fades and the raw reality of power dynamics takes over. Congress just reminded the executive branch that checks and balances aren't optional. They're structural. And when lawmakers from both parties unite to protect their institutional authority, even the most powerful president faces limits. In my opinion, this is one of those moments where the system works exactly as the framers intended. Not smoothly, not without conflict, but ultimately in defense of constitutional boundaries that prevent any one branch from accumulating unchecked power. So where does this go from here? Trump has three options. He can comply fully, release all frozen funds, and operate within the new constraints Congress just imposed. That would avoid further conflict, but might be seen as capitulation. He can test the resolution by continuing to freeze funds and arguing that executive authority supersedes congressional limitations. That would trigger an immediate constitutional showdown, likely ending up in federal courts. Or he can negotiate a middle ground where Congress provides more flexibility in exchange for enhanced oversight and transparency. That's the politically safest route, but requires compromise, something this administration hasn't shown much appetite for. The timeline matters too. Midterm elections are approaching, voters are watching, and lawmakers who voted to limit Trump's authority just sent a message to their constituents. We're defending the Constitution, not just defending a president. If Trump defies the resolution and Congress responds with contempt proceedings or impeachment articles, that becomes a defining campaign issue. Democrats will run on accountability and checks and balances. Republicans who voted yes will argue they stood up for institutional integrity. And if Trump complies, his opponents will frame it as proof that even his own party doesn't trust him with unchecked power. Either way, this vote changes the political landscape heading into the most consequential midterms in years. The bottom line is this: Congress just united across party lines to block presidential authority in ways we haven't seen in decades. A bipartisan supermajority voted to limit Trump's ability to freeze congressionally appropriated funds. The resolution carries enforcement mechanisms including contempt proceedings and potential impeachment grounds. This isn't just another partisan fight. This is the legislative branch reclaiming constitutional authority it believes the executive branch has been usurping, and the White House is in damage control mode trying to navigate a political landscape that just shifted dramatically. What happens next doesn't just affect Trump's presidency. It affects the balance of power between Congress and the executive branch for every future administration. It reshapes how presidents understand the limits of their authority. And it sends a signal that institutional boundaries still matter, even in the most polarized political environment in modern history. The stakes are enormous, the precedent is historic, and the implications will echo through American governance for years to come. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit subscribe. We're covering every major development in this constitutional showdown as it unfolds. No spin, no exaggeration, just the facts, the analysis, and the context you need to understand what's really happening. I appreciate you.